Hi everyone, I'm Tyler with Bedford Camera and Video. I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person this year at the Ozark Media Arts Festival, but I'm excited that we're able to share from our PhotoCon Live virtual learning series with you. Today we have pro photographer and Tamron Tech Team member Jill Bell for a fun look at some things you can photograph around your house or neighborhood. Jill will show some easy examples of projects you can shoot without big investments in props or other equipment. Take some notes and we hope you enjoy.
Hey everyone, thanks for checking this out tonight. Today we have Jillian Bell and she's going to do a presentation on macro photography. How you doing, Jillian?
I am well. Thanks for having me, Ken.
Cool. I'm going to let you get right into it, so have at it. Bye.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Getting Up Close with my macro lens. My name is Jillian Bell. A couple of things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the definitions of macro. I'm going to talk about the explanation of features, specifically of our 90mm lens, because I get a lot of questions about that in the field. And this lens showcases some new technology that I want to make sure that you guys know about that actually translates into a lot of the other lenses in the Tamron line. In this section, there'll be some tips on insect photography. Then we'll look for light, and I'll give you some flower tips in there. Lastly, we're going to check the background, show you some tips on photographing jewelry, and then leave the presentation with just some everyday inspirations. Macro photography is one of those subjects that is very accessible. It's the most second genre that people get into. So if they've mastered their camera or they're looking for something else to do, macro photography is definitely one of those things that many photographers on any level will gravitate towards. I also wanted to highlight a new section on our website called Homeschool. You can find the link simply doing an internet search for Tamron Homeschool, or it's one of the featured links on tamron-usa.com. Specifically, I've got a class in there about 5 simple setups that you can do at home. So this class, really, I want you to get into the mindset of macro photography. Macro photography as a whole is a different way to look at the world. And so I'm going to go through some ideas and how I approach a scene. And hopefully that'll help simplify your work and get you a little bit better at macro photography in your own home. This webinar, the one on the website, has match photography. I deal with splash photography, setting that up, dealing with extension tubes and macro. You can also try to find my Beyond Macro class as a take 2 to this one, where we'll talk specifically about extension tubes and focus stacking. Like I said, my name's Jillian Bell. You can find me socially online at Bell Tamron USA. Basically, out of the tech team that we have here at Tamron, I am known as the macro photographer. I can literally take any scene, any genre, whether it's portraits or landscapes, night skies, and somehow turn it into a macro image. It's how I see the world. And I think, these ideas can translate into other genres as well. So I'm really excited to share some of my techniques and my mindset with you. Let's get started. Starting off with those simple definitions, close-up versus true macro. There are many common conversations that I'll have in a macro workshop or a photo shoot, in the fact that, what are the ratios? People get so bogged down with the ratios and the minimum focusing distance and all the technical aspects of macro photography that honestly, at the end of the day, as long as you're taking the images that you're trying to create, don't get too bogged down about the minutia of the ratios and the fractions and all of the ratios. But I wanted to showcase a little bit of what that means and how that relates to imagery and the lenses that you're using. So on the far right-hand side, you'll see true macro. True macro is a life-size representation of an image if you were to place it on the sensor. We call that 1-to-1, 100% life-size. And basically what this does is, if you were to imagine a quarter, because we all kind of know the size of a quarter, you can literally see that and pick that up. Hopefully, if you have one laying around, imagine, if you will, if you were to actually open up your camera to the sensor and place that quarter on that sensor. Huge disclaimer, do not actually do this. You will damage your camera, you will break your sensor. But imagine, hypothetically, again, you were to place that quarter on your sensor and print out a 16 by 20 print. In 1:1 macro, that quarter on that 16 by 20 print will be 16 inches in diameter. Life size, again, a life-size representation of that image if you were to place it on the sensor. The image in the middle is what we consider 1:2 macro or half life size. Same 16 by 20 print, but now that quarter is represented 8 inches in diameter. It's half life size. Lastly, on the left-hand side, this is considered close-up photography, and that's a 1:4 ratio or 25% life size. Same 16 by 20 print. That quarter is now 4 inches in diameter. Again, 25% its true size if you were to place that image on the sensor. Now, conceptually, I kind of think about it a little differently. The definition of close-up photography in my world, in my mindset, it's basically the art of highlighting smaller subjects. Doesn't matter if they're teeny tiny, if they're kind of small, if they're not quite small. But basically, when you're dealing with a close-up photograph, it is specifically a photograph of something that happens to be small. A little figurine that you have on your desk, maybe. The main subject, the main goal here, again, is to actively identify what the subject is. Maybe it's a photograph of a butterfly on a flower. Close-up photography is very easily obtained by many of the lenses that are out there today. Specifically in the Tamron line, you can get a 1:4 or 1:3 or sometimes 1:2 in the case of the new Sony Primes, and give us this image that actively represents a butterfly or a rusty hinge or something that you just happen to find interesting out in the real world. Thinking about focal lengths here, a wider angle lens is going to give you an image that's a little bit more environmental. So you can literally see the flowers in the background, you can see the conservatory and the garden of which we are in, versus more of a telephoto lens is going to compress the background. It's going to be much less distracting. It's literally going to be about the subjects. Here, a really awesome photograph of some acrylic art that I found in the Portland airport. So people took pieces of acrylic and cut them out into different shapes and created these multi-layered semi-transparent scenes that with the light coming through in the background, just created these just beautiful little like aerated sort of scenes. But again, this subject is highly identifiable. It's chairs with a tree, with a swing. It's close-up photography. If you're using a zoom lens that has close-up capabilities, your minimum focusing distance definitely comes into play, or MOD, minimum object distance in Tamron land. This is basically the point where your lens can't find focus anymore because your subject is too close. How many times have you found a lens? You know, you've got your camera here and you find something interesting and you physically get your camera closer and closer and closer to it and your camera can't find focus anymore. Basically, that means you are too close. The minimum focusing distance, or the minimum object distance, is measured from the sensor plane. It's the circle with the line through it you see on the screen. It's generally up here on your camera. So we do not measure from the end of the lens. We always measure from the sensor plane. And so to get close-up photographs or get better detail with the zoom lens, what you want to do is zoom the lens all the way out, get within the minimum focusing distance, and that'll give you the best magnification, the best macro capability that your lens will give you. A little bit backwards way to think about it. So zoom the lens all the way out and then get as close as you physically can to that subject. That'll give you the best magnification within your zoom range. Definition of macro photography. So in comparison to close-up, where we are highlighting something that happens to be small, in macro photography, this is a completely different way to think about your subject. It's all about what do you find interesting about the subject you're photographing. So it's less about what the subject actually is, but more about what do you find interesting about that thing. In the case of the butterfly, I love the wings. The wings is this beautiful representation of repeating colors, repeating shapes, subtle line work, and it's much more abstract, where you can kind of get the idea that this is a butterfly wing, but it's not a butterfly on a flower. It's, again, what we find interesting about the subject. That makes it a macro photograph. When we are photographing at 1:1 ratio, Traditionally, you are going to need a macro lens to do this. So in many of these images, again, I'm going to highlight the 90mm macro to showcase its technology, its capabilities, and this one-to-one macro idea. Going back to that quarter from the original example. So in this case, we can tell it's a coin, we can tell it's possibly a quarter if we've seen these on the back, but the image itself is about the detailed, the subtle engraving, the artwork that happens to be on the back of this currency. So think about, what do you find interesting about the thing that you're photographing? Simplify, simplify, simplify. Wanted to take a couple moments in this next session, again, to highlight the 90mm macro, to highlight the current technology in the Tamron lineup, and how this is going to greatly enhance your photographic experience out in the real world. Technology in general is going to be able to give you a cleaner, clearer image edge to edge. It's also going to give you an opportunity to photograph in many different types of weather, so rain, snow, sand, things like that. It's also going to give you much better speed and performance. So with the new stabilization on the left, the VC and the USD autofocusing motor, this is specifically for speed and performance. The stabilization works in a 3-axis system. So this is going to allow you, the photographer, to photograph at much, much slower shutter speeds. Tamron stabilization works in an XYZ pattern. It's figure 8. So it stabilizes you on all directions. The 90 specifically adds a 4th axis to it, so we can also do pitch and yaw. Think about it as a gimbal head that's literally built inside of your lens to help compensate for your motion at slower shutter speeds. Secondly, the USD, the autofocusing motor, comes into play because when we autofocus, it needs to be fast, it needs to be robust, it needs to be able to find that contrast and just snap onto it. Macro lenses have a huge range of focus from 11 inches to infinity, and so out of focus at 11 inches can look the same to the lens as out of focus at infinity. And so again, having that fast autofocusing motor allows you to find that focus faster. I do many of these images in autofocus. It's perfectly okay. I can manually focus my imagery, but for the most part, I'm going to pick a single point autofocus and use my autofocus, use my aperture priority mode to help control my depth of field. Do not need to photograph in full manual to get great imagery. In this scene, highlighting that VC, that image stabilization technology, I love taking photographs in model train museums. This is an H-gate little guy. And the hard thing with train museums is they're generally in a big warehouse with very bad light. And they also generally will not allow you to bring in a tripod or a monopod because space is really confined. You've got a lot of different setups in a small amount of space. And so you're going to have to handhold this. At 1/8 of a second, VC off, you can very clearly see that this is not a clear image. I go ahead and turn that VC on and it snaps into focus. F2.8 gives me a great shallow depth of field, letting in as much light as I possibly can so I don't have to crank up my ISO too terribly much. But that makes a huge difference just turning that stabilization on. In this next scene, this is a great example of that stabilization and the ultrasonic motor working together. So I'm going to treat butterflies and insects the same way that I would treat a bird in flight or photographing sports. Center weighted focus, center weighted metering. It's going to be the most sensitive to find contrast. And then I'm going to use a continuous shooting mode and sway ever so slightly back and forth. This is exaggerated to try to get that moment exactly in focus where I want it to be. So in this case, this piano keys butterfly, which is about 1 inch high, he's very small, is sitting on a broad leaf of a plant, swaying ever so gently. This is one image out of 50 that wonderfully turned out. Everything was in focus exactly where I wanted it to be. The rest, the other 49, you just delete. Nobody has to see those. All that matters is you got the shot you wanted. Another great technology that we're implementing in many of the Tamron lenses is this moisture resistant construction. So the 90 specifically, because it's an internal lens, it's not a zoom lens, it's internal focusing, it can be moisture proof. So those red lines are physical gaskets that we put in the lens to make sure that it's water resistant, dust resistant, oil resistant. This is going to get you out into a whole new crop of situations that you might not necessarily feel comfortable bringing your gear, i.e. the rain, i.e. snowstorms, maybe a little bit of sand on the beach. All of these things are going to easily clean off as long as you remember to clean your lens before you store it for a long period of time. We pair the moisture-resistant construction with a fluorine coating to help repel dust, water, and oil from the front element of the lens, keeps it easy clean. And then also in this case, we have an E-band coating. This is a nano coating that we also put on that front element. This is going to protect your images from ghosting, flare, chromatic aberrations, again, allowing us to create an image in camera that is clean and clear, edge to edge, corner to corner. I really dislike editing my photos after the fact. So if I can get it crisp and clean in camera, that's a really great place that I want to be in. In this situation, early morning dew, I love photographing raindrops in the morning. And this image was created wonderfully while I was trying to drive to the airport. And I almost missed my flight because, the sun was setting. I'm looking out in the ditch with all this long grass, and it was lighting up like glitter paper because of all these little raindrops catching the light. So of course, pulled over, grabbed my 90, happened to have my camera on hand, which is a lesson I learned a long time ago. Have your camera on, always have your batteries charged. And you can literally just sit for a moment. Same sort of technique with the butterflies, single point autofocus, little bit of multi-burst mode, and just ever so slightly trying to keep in line with that blade of grass. It was backlit, so all those striation lines were really illuminated, giving you a little bit more visual interest in this scene. If you don't happen to be a morning person or you don't happen to have dewy grass on hand, use a water bottle, spritz it up. This moisture-resistant construction also really helps during pollen season. So if you're out in a garden, over an hour or two, you might start to notice that there's a little bit of pollen that's starting to accumulate on your bag, on your gear. And again, having a lens that is protected against dust, water, and moisture is going to better protect your gear. It's going to better protect your lenses from the elements. The last thing that I'm going to showcase, and this is a question that I get very, very often with that 90mm macro. There's a little switch that is on the side of the lens, and you'll see a similar switch on the 150 to 600. It says full, and then it's got 0.5 meters to infinity, and then on the bottom position, it's 0.3 meters to 0.5 meters. What does this do? Why is this important? This is called the electronic digital limiter switch. And basically, like I said, when you have a lens that can focus from 11 inches to infinity and autofocus looks the same through that whole range, if it's out of focus, in areas of low contrast where I'm noticing that my lens is searching a lot, I can use this distance limiter switch to tell the lens more specifically where my subject is. The full position, it's going to again look through that whole range, 11 inches to infinity. That middle position is what I call the portrait range, so it's only going to look about 1.5 feet out to infinity. And then that bottom position, that is for true macro, it's only going to look for subject matter between 11 inches and 1.5 feet. Basically, I'm going to leave it on full most of the time, but in autofocus, if my lens is having trouble, it's searching more than I would like, I can use this distance limiter switch to help the lens out and tell my subject where it is. The other cool thing about this feature is if you happen to have the tap-in console at home, this is an extra accessory that most people think is just for firmware updates. But in this case, you can use it to customize your stabilization, how that works with you. In the case of the distance limiter switch, you can actually customize where those hurdles are, where those positions end up. The bottom position, I like to open up a little bit more. So instead of going from 11 inches to 1.5 feet, I like to open it up a little bit to 2 feet because that for me is generally where my subject ends up. The middle position, you can go 1.5 feet to infinity, you can go 3 feet to infinity, you can go, any of those ranges. You customize it the way that you photograph. And I think that's pretty cool. The same thing goes into play with that 150 to 600 as well. All right, let's get into the fun bit, macro at home. So like I said in the beginning, the main goal of this presentation is to get you into the mindset of macro. When I approach a scene, how do I approach it? What do I think about? How can I help you with your own work to create better imagery at home? And the first thing you do is you definitely find a subject. You have to find something that you find interesting and you want to photograph it. That is step one. Step two is I always look for the light, because I want the light to either, help my scene or create contrast, create drama. Here's just a simple image of the setup. And the LED light that I'm using, this can take the place of an LED that you have. It can take the place of an open window or a harsh daylight scene. It's basically you have a single light source that is really bright, really contrasty. On the bottom, you'll see a reflector. I'm going to pull that in as well. So how do we handle this? Because again, the great thing about macro photography is that you can photograph imagery like this at any time of day in any kind of weather. You don't have to wake up before sunrise. You don't have to wait for the moon to set to get Milky Way images. Most of my macro imagery happens at 2 o'clock in the afternoon while I'm walking around having lunch. Using the natural light, so again, a single light source, you can see that in this image, it's very harsh, it's very dramatic, it has a lot of contrast. This reminds me of maybe more of a theatrical type lighting. And in most scenes, this isn't what generally people want. We don't want a lot of contrast. We don't want a lot of shadows. So how can we combat that? The first thing I can do is I can bring in that reflector. So in this case, I've got my light source coming from my left-hand side. My reflector, I'm going to catch that light and bounce it back in to fill in those shadows on the other side, creating still high contrast, but an even illuminated subject from left to right. The background here is dark because the light hitting my subject is in the sun, and there is no light, or my background is in the shadow, so it automatically creates a darker black background. The other thing I can use is I can diffuse the light. So in contrast to reflecting that light in, we still get that balanced light, but the look is very soft. It's much softer. And what I'll do here is, again, as my light is coming from the left-hand side, I'm going to put that diffuser in between my light source and my subject. And that's going to soften the light, that's going to diffuse the light, and create a more even exposure between my subject and my background. You can see here my background is much, much lighter because now my subject is in shade and my background is in shade. Now let's pull this out into the backyard, into an everyday situation. Again, single white light source. This is the sun, middle of the afternoon. I found something interesting, which is this is a poppy. This is a California poppy out near San Diego during the super bloom a couple years ago. I never knew that they were orange before I saw these, and I just loved how the whole countryside was lit up in orange. But again, the lighting in the middle of the day is never conducive to good imagery. First thing I'm going to do is combat the light. So I found my subject, now I'm going to address my light. And in this case, I use that diffuser just to even out the sunny spots and the shady spots, giving me a nice illuminated scene from left to right. You can simply do this if you don't have a diffuser by sometimes even just standing in the way of your subject, creating shade and creating a shadow with your own body. Once I even out the light, the last step is working on composition. So in this case, photographing the poppy more at a 90-degree angle allowed those stems to create wonderful leading lines. And now I could also get the repeated shape of the other poppies of this super bloom in the background, just to showcase how many there were in such a small space. You can also use the flower itself as a background. In this case, again, I'm photographing an orchid, but in this flower, what do you find interesting in the flower that you're photographing? And it's generally going to be the center bits, the stamen, the pollen pods, things like that. And again, here I'm using a shallow depth of field, just allowing the subtle color in the background to be the background. Doesn't matter what else is going on around it. I also always look for deformed petals or funky leaves, things that will differentiate my photograph from other ones I've seen of the same flower. How can you make yours unique? In this case, I've got a teeny tiny little Gerber daisy. This was one of the first ones that hit this spring, and it was looking out the window, reaching towards the sun. And I love the fact that flowers and like feathers and are slightly translucent. So if you kick them with a little bit of backlight, the saturation is just going to light up the scene. You're going to get much better color, a softer feel. Exposing for the shadows is going to allow my background just to blow out and go to white. The image here, the highlight, the subject matter is that little leaf on the bottom. Almost completely walked away until I turned around and said, I haven't photographed the back of this flower yet. And I noticed that little heart shape, and it just made my day. It made me smile. You know, this was back in March when we first started staying home, and I was really missing my life on the road. And this kind of made my day better for a moment. In this next section, I want to talk about the backgrounds. So once I've figured out my subject, once I've figured out my lighting, I always make a double check to the background, because the background is going to make or break your image. It can either enhance your subject matter or distract from your main point of focus. So never forget about your background in macro photography. In this scene, I've got a little bit of my spaghetti squash when it was started up in my house before I planted them outside. Loved all the little fuzzy bits on the leaves. That was the main subject here. Got my lighting in place, single white light source with that LED, nothing too fancy. But the background here was not helping this image at all. I was just looking out the window into my dirty deck, and it was very distracting. It wasn't highlighting the scene at all. So I started looking around my house to figure out, what can I use for my background? And the cool thing about this, especially in macro, most of your subjects aren't more than a 4x6 inch area in size. So you can get paint swatches, you can get sheets of remnant fabric, little pieces of fabric, you can get scrapbooking paper, things like that. And all of these things are very easily dropped in to change out your background. In this first example, I'm using a piece of styrofoam packing material that I got in the mail the day before. Just a little white piece of hard, this is styrofoam, dropped in the background of my image. Gives it better contrast, gives it more of a commercial look, clean, crisp, something a little bit more natural, using a gray background. And this is a gray knit cap that I found in my closet, wrapped around a paper towel roll. Again, simply just swapping out the background is going to completely change the look of the scene. Same single light source hitting the front of that subject. Looking around a little bit further, I found this cute little swatch of remnant fabric. This reminds me of a garden. Maybe those out of focus flowers are tomatoes in the background, or it has a very homey kind of garden feel to it in comparison. Again, just wrapping it around a paper towel roll. You do not need anything fancy. You can also take this idea outside. So if you are out photographing in a very busy garden, or maybe there's a lot of people or tourists in the background, you want to cut all of them out. I will very often have a little collection of pieces of paper, little cardboard, maybe some cardstock, some like flimsy plastic cutting boards that I've cut up. I've used those too. You can cut sheets that are about 6x9, the smallest as I'll cut, or I'll do 12x12 if I just need a piece of material that's about this big. The idea here is just to drop in a little swatch of color behind your subject matter to simplify the background. This is done in natural, everyday afternoon light. Picking this bright green chartreuse color to balance off that like bright magenta red of the flower. This vibe is very 80s punk rock, very like acrylic paint, very abstract. So let's now talk about jewelry. Let's shift gears a little bit. When I'm photographing jewelry or metallic subjects, this is going to be something that's a little more set up. So up until this point, most of these images have been handheld, autofocus, on the fly, finding imagery as the inspiration follows. In these situations, I'm going to actually have a setup. It's going to be on a tabletop. My camera's going to be on a tripod, specifically because I want to be hands-free just in case I'm moving my subject around, just in case I need to hold something in place. It's best to be hands-free when you're photographing product or jewelry. I'm going to always use a polarizing filter to help with reflections and help with saturation of color. If I have unruly reflections that might come from an overhead light or might come from a window that I just can't get rid of with that polarizing filter, I'm going to use a blackboard. And the reason I do this is because, again, I want to try to get it right in camera. I very rarely want to have to spend time after the fact on my laptop and heal out or clone out all these little pieces. And a blackboard is simply just a piece of black foam core that I put on a pencil because that's what I had on hand. And you can use these little boards, I've got many of them in different shapes, specifically right around your subject, and figure out where those reflections are coming from and cut them out. You can hold them just outside a frame, and it does the trick sometimes. Always, always, always diffuse your light in these scenes. Another fun tip when you're working with reflections. So in this case, I found this beautiful leaf bracelet on a walk down in Times Square. Found this beautiful piece of jewelry behind glass. I love the advertisement in the back. But when you're photographing a subject behind glass, the trouble is the reflections. You don't want to show up in your scene. You don't want the street lights across the street to show up in your image. And so the best thing you can do here is try to get your lens as close to that piece of glass as possible. I'm going to take my lens hood off and very gently place my lens directly onto that piece of glass. And that's going to help cut out reflections. Wearing black or a muted color also helps in these scenes, so your bright orange shirt doesn't reflect into your photograph. Another great metallic example, this is called flat lay. So basically it's a tabletop setup where my camera is facing straight down and I'm setting up my scene on a table below it. I love this idea because it's very easy to manipulate the scene and create the imagery with found objects. This is a technique I'll use often. So in this case, I'm combining skeleton keys that I found at the flea market with fun inspirational keys that I found at the scrapbooking store. And it's little things like placing those keys at the right angle to help create those leading lines, or placing those words at the exact same spot to help visually move the viewer's eye around the frame. This is definitely a hands-free environment, so my camera's on a tripod. And I will actually, because these are keys and because metal is slippery, I'm going to stick a little bit of double-stick tape on the back of all of those keys. That little bit is going to help them stick together and not slide around, because the last thing you want is to actually have your whole setup in place and you're getting ready to take the image and then you bump the table, or your dog runs through it and shakes the floor and everything shifts. And so a little bit of double stick tape, you can also use rubber cement, is going to be the trick to keep everything exactly where you want it to be. In this last little section, I wanted to leave with you some inspirational photographs, things that you can photograph around your home and find interesting. You know, we've all kind of fallen into this everyday mentality of we are in our house every day. And so it's not special, it's not unique anymore because you're there all the time. So I want to encourage you to walk around your own home and find some things that maybe you didn't think were interesting before. And how can we use this macro mindset to get some really great imagery? In this first one, this is my lawnmower. Went out to the garage, cleaned it up a little bit so that, you know, it wasn't so gross and disgusting. But I love the patina on these hoses coming in, the brass, the oxidization there, the old rubber tubes. Again, that subtle color play between the reds and the greens creates this beautiful image out of an everyday object. In this case, this is an Edison bulb, so it's one of those light bulbs that you can actually see the filament bouncing around on the inside. And when you photograph light bulbs, the trick here is not to have them on all the way. So this bulb was in one of my outlets that was a dimmable switch, and I had it on ever so slightly, maybe 5–10%, just enough to get those filaments to illuminate. The problem with that is that your shutter speeds are very, very low because there's not a lot of light coming through. So the stabilization is going to come into play here if you're autofocusing it and if you're not on a tripod. If you're someone who either enjoys cooking or has a new love of cooking, think about those ingredients before you put them in, or while you're making your dish. In this case, a very simple clove of garlic on a dark cutting board, to me, resembles like a fine art painting, an oil painting. Very simple. Again, what is it about the things that you find interesting, and how can we highlight them? Lastly, a simple cassette tape. And in this case, the magnetic ribbon, that's what it is, sorry. The magnetic ribbon just kind of bouncing around inside of that window was the inspiration here. I love that. I love the differences in spacing and just how light and delicate it is. The problem was the first couple images I got too close. I just highlighted that plastic window and it abstracted the scene way too much. You had no idea what this was an image of. And so pulling back just a little bit to give the idea that this was a cassette tape so you get a nod of what the subject is, I think made this a strong image. Again, everyday objects, go around your home, see what you can photograph. All in all, thank you for your time in this presentation. Please stay connected with us. I am Belle Tamron USA on Facebook and Instagram. You can also find other images taken with Tamron glass using the hashtag #WithMyTamron. Let me know what you'd like to know.